So now that you know a bit about the ForkJoin framework and its overall goals and its overall design and the paradigm it supports of divide and conquer, let's start talking about some of the classes that you'll have to use when you program with it. And we'll start off by talking about the ForkJoinPool class. This class implements the ExecutorService interface. You don't have to know a whole lot about that in this course, but just be aware that there's an inheritance hierarchy that's taking place here. And this interface is the basis for a bunch of other subclasses that you might use if you do a lot of other Java concurrent programming. So the ExecutorService is an interface which serves as the root of a bunch of other things. There's something called the ThreadPoolExecutor and the scheduled ThreadPoolExecutor, which are used to execute runnables and callables. We don't care a whole lot about those in this class. However, what we do care about is the ForkJoinPool class, which executes ForkJoin tasks. And we'll talk about what a ForkJoin task is in just a second. You can also use the ForkJoinPool to execute runnables and callables because of the inheritance relationships that take place in this hierarchy. But that's not really the main reason for using it, although it does come in handy from time to time. For various reasons, there are only a handful of knobs that are defined that you can use to control a ForkJoinPool. Almost everything here is just methods for passing tasks to the framework itself. Very, very little you can do to control it. We'll talk about one thing later that you can use to control the number of threads in something known as the common ForkJoinPool. But it's kind of like a one-button mouse. It doesn't give you lots of room for control. And the reason for this is that they wanted to make this framework so powerful and so internally adaptive that programmers didn't have to futz around with other control knobs. And if you want to learn more about the design philosophy and the patterns and so on that went into building the ForkJoinPool, take a look at this wonderful video by my friend and colleague Doug Lee, who wrote most of it, and he'll explain the reasoning behind why it works the way it does and why there's very few knobs. In contrast, the ThreadPoolExecutor framework, which is what's provided by earlier versions of Java to support different kinds of thread pools, has lots of control knobs. So in addition to all those methods that we just saw that have to do with things like executing stuff and invoking stuff, there's all these other methods here. This is just a subset of them, in fact, that control various things. And you can control things like how many threads there are in the pool, and how big the pool can grow, and what kind of work queue you have in order to be able to pass things from the client to the thread pool. You can figure out how long you want the threads to live if they're not being used. You can have these things called thread factories that determine what kinds of threads are created. You can figure out what to do if too much work is given and there's not enough resources to process all the work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots and lots and lots of control knobs that you can set and tweak and tune to your heart's content. And the goal there was to make it possible to maximally customize a common piece of infrastructure. In fact, the ThreadPoolExecutor is commonly exposed through a couple of wrappers, or I guess you would call them adapters in a way, such as the fixed size thread pool, the cached thread pool, and so on and so forth. We don't care about that in this class, but it's just interesting to note. The one thing you can configure, or one of the main things you can configure, is the size of the so-called common ForkJoinPool. Remember that there's this thing called a common ForkJoinPool, which is where everything goes if you don't make your own thread pool. And for pretty much everything we're going to do in this class, especially from an assignment point of view, the common ForkJoinPool is what we'll be using. That's what the parallel streams model uses under the hood by default. There's two different ways to set the number of threads in the common ForkJoinPool. One is by setting this with a system property, which is a little bit verbose. And it's also a little bit wonky for reasons we will talk about later. So that's one way to do it. And the other way to do it is by having instances of a ForkJoinPool ManagedBlocker. And the ManagedBlocker mechanism can be used to dynamically adjust the number of threads kind of magically behind the scenes. It's almost as if the framework knows how to tune its own threads by changing the settings internally if you use this interface. You will get experience with this. Our first programming assignment gives you experience with this, and we'll talk a lot more about it because it's very cool. So that's the end of the overview of the Java ForkJoinPool class.